What's going on, guys? My name's Matt, and today we're going to be looking at the results of my DIY running economy testing to determine which running shoes are the fastest for me. We'll look at the original Alphafly, the Vaporfly 2, and see how the new Alphalfy 3 stacks up in comparison. Now, a little bit of background about why I'm so obsessed with shoes. I ran track and cross country in high school and a little bit in college in what I would call the pre-Supershoe era. I took about a 10-year hiatus from running, and then I started running again about 2 years ago. And when I returned, I realized the game had kind of changed entirely while I'd been away, with Nike releasing the first Supershoe, the Vaporfly 4%. So when I was looking into getting my first pair of super shoes, I wanted to know which ones were the best, because I want to run as fast as possible. So I found this study, a comparison of running economy across 7 carbon-plated racing shoes. And this study found that the best ones of the ones they tested at the time were the Alphafly, the Vaporfly 2, and the ASICS Metaspeed Sky, with the Alphafly having the largest average running economy benefit, but the Vaporfly 2 and the Metaspeed Sky not being significantly different. Now, the lead author of this study, Dustin Jobert, has a PhD in kinesiology, and he also runs an Instagram account by the name of Lab Rat Rundown, where he tests himself running in a bunch of different shoes and publishes the results. So this project is heavily inspired by his research and testing. There's some individual variation between how a runner will respond to different shoes, so of course I wanted to test this for myself, as well as test newer shoes that hadn't been included in the original study. How do we test this? What is running economy, and how does this testing work? Well, so running economy is essentially how much oxygen a runner uses to run at a specific pace. And so you need a device that measures the rate at which you're using oxygen. If your running economy is higher, if you're using less oxygen to run at a given pace, then you can run at a little bit higher of a pace and therefore have a faster race result. And so anyway, we need a device that measures the rate at which you're using oxygen. When I was first looking into this, the first thing I came across was called a metabolic cart, and these are what they use in real labs, and they cost in the ballpark of $50,000. So I'm of course not going to buy that. The next thing I found was much more economical option called a VO2 Master Analyzer, for the low price of $6,295. I don't have $6,000 for this. So I was excited when I came across this website, which showed me how to make your own DIY VO2 Max device for a cost of all in probably about $300. But $200 of that was buying a 3D printer, and so if I need to make a second device, if this one breaks, device is right here, by the way. If I need to make a second device, if this one breaks, that'll probably cost about $100. Because I can, print many more parts on my 3D printer. So how do we go about doing this testing? So we're testing the 3 shoes I mentioned, the Alphafly 1, the Vaporfly 2, and the Alphafly 3, as well as the Saucony Endorphin Shift 3, which is kind of my daily trainer, and we're going to use that as the control shoe. So we're testing each shoe by running on a treadmill while I wear this VO2 Max device to essentially see how much oxygen I'm using in each shoe at a given pace. So first I did a 2-mile warm-up, and then I did 5 minutes recovery before each trial, and then 4 minutes in each shoe running at 6-minute mile pace, which is about my marathon pace. And so the first 2 minutes of each trial are kind of supposed to be the warm-up period, and then we're looking at the average VO2 usage for the second 2-minute period in each shoe. We randomize the order, and we test each shoe twice, backwards and forwards. So the Shift, for example, was tested 1st and 8th. The Alphafly 1 was tested 2nd and 7th, and so on. Now, I ran into a couple of issues with this first version of the test, and so I'm planning on doing a retest and hopefully fixing some of those issues, which I'll get into a little bit more when I look at the data. But one of the issues was I accidentally clicked the off switch when I was in the middle of the first trial with my shifts, so I don't have the data from the very first shift trial. Also, somehow during the second trial, my first test with the Alphafly 1, the device disconnected from my phone that was collecting the data. So I also don't have that data. So I have the results of 6 trials, and so it's imperfect. So there's already some problems with the test. So let's look at the results. As you can see here, on the left axis we have the VO2, basically how much oxygen, the rate at which I'm using oxygen across the span of each test. And then along the bottom is the duration in seconds. So each test is 4 minutes or 240 seconds. And we can see at least approximately the device works as I'm getting into it and running a little bit more. The rate at which I'm using oxygen increases across each trial. As I mentioned, I lost most of the data from the first trial and most of the data from the Alphalfly trial 1. So only 6 of the results have trial. So what we're looking for here, the first 2 minutes is treated as a warm-up, and the second 2 minutes we're hoping or attempting to achieve kind of a steady state with the results. If we achieve a steady state, the rate at which we're using oxygen will be consistent, and we'll be able to get an accurate measure of the relative running economy of each shoe. So if we look at this second graph, it's a little bit more zoomed in on just the second 2 minutes, and we're also zoomed in the range at which the VO2 values are in. So it may be a little bit hard to see all the different numbers, but you can see even in the third minute here, it's bouncing around a little bit, all the different devices, but it does seem like it stabilizes somewhat in the 4th minute of the trial. So what I'm using in the results is the average of the data from this whole second 2 minute period for each shoe. So results show that the Alphalfly 1 has about a 2% lower running economy. Now again, we're using the trial only from the data only from the second trial, the Alphalfly 1, because I lost the data from the first trial. For the control, we're using the Shift, which was the last shoe I tested. But we see that Alphalfly 1 shows some running economy benefit, about 2%. The Alphalfly 3 actually performed worse than the Shift using this test. And then the Vaporfly 2 performed much better across this 2 minute period, measuring the running economy. And so the other thing I looked at was, because as I'd shown, the data sort of seemed to stabilize in the second minute, and especially in the last 30 seconds, I wanted to look at what the values were if we just looked at the average of the last minute or the last 30 seconds. And we can see the results don't necessarily change, or at least the story doesn't change that much. The Alphalfly 1 changes a little bit, but the Alphalfly 3 is a little bit worse, and the Vaporfly 2 is still performing the best across that period. One of the things that I want to do the next time we test is a test for a longer period of time. Maybe I had a race coming up, and so I didn't want to do too long of a test and wear myself out by doing 8-mile repeats essentially the week of my race. So I only did 4 minutes in each shoe. I think that doing a longer trial would give hopefully a longer time period to stabilize and reach that steady state that we're looking for, and that might give different results. So a few other caveats about this testing. I don't think the VO2 device is probably well calibrated. Based on what I've read, I would expect my VO2 values to be closer to about 50 at marathon pace than the 40 that they're hovering around here. I'm hoping that what I really care about is the relative difference of the values, not the actual values. And I'm not testing my VO2 max, at least as part of this experiment. So I'm hoping that doesn't cause problems, but I would guess that the device is not well calibrated. It's also possible that the data from my device is more volatile than you would get from a more professional device. Now, I haven't used a real metabolic cart or that VO2 master analyzer that I showed, so maybe the data always will bounce around a little bit. So that's something that I'm gonna have to just see with more testing if I can get a more stable value. And of course, to have a perfect study, I need a lot more trials in each shoe under the same conditions, maybe with a better device, and ideally blinded, so I don't know which shoe I'm running in for each trial. Now, I don't think that's really possible or practical, so that's not something I'm going to try, but that's what I would do in an ideal world. And so different people might respond differently to different shoes. This data is applicable to me. The data from the trial only tested 12 male runners that had around a 16-minute 5K personal best. So that actually is pretty applicable to me, but different runners could have different responses to different shoes. Now, I was surprised by the results of this testing. I wasn't that surprised that the Alphalfly 3 doesn't seem to stack up. I had heard subjectively from some people, and as well as lab rats testing, that it maybe wasn't performing as well as the original Alphafly. But I was also surprised that the Vaporfly 2 seemed to perform so much better for me than the Alphafly 1. That Supershoe study that I shared showed that the Alphalfly 1 performed a tiny bit better than the Vaporfly 2, although, again, the difference wasn't statistically significant. In addition, lab rats case study data had consistently shown the Alphalfly 1 to be the best shoe for him. So I had kind of just assumed that the Vaporfly 2 was pretty good, but the Alphalfly 1 was a little bit better. Now, prior to my first marathon, I did one workout each in the Vaporfly 2 and the Alphalfly 1, and that workout went a lot better in the Vaporfly 2, so I did run my first marathon in the Vaporfly 2, and it went very well for me at the time. But since then, I've kind of favored the Alphafly in my races, and the majority of my workouts, my PRs from 5K through the marathon, are all set in the Alphafly. I also think the Alphaflys tend to hold up better to higher mileage. I still love running in my Alphaflys after they have well over 300 miles. And my older Vaporflies feel a little iffy after 150 miles. Running economy testing in worn-out shoes is something that I'm gonna have to test another time, but that's another test I intend to perform at some point. The results of this made me question which shoe is truly faster. I went back and looked at similar workouts I'd done in the Vaporfly 2 and Alphafly 1, and I found that the workouts were at least as good in the Vaporfly, if not maybe a tiny bit better. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of different things that vary between workouts, since that's even less scientific. There might be better weather, or you're better rested, or you're gaining or losing fitness during a time period. But it's one more data point that made me question my assumption that the Alphafly ones were better for me. So tonight, actually, I have a 5K, and I figured, why not give the Vaporfly 2s a shot? And since I'm sure that race will be before this video is edited, I will share the results. I just wanted to follow up on that race as promised, and I did run in the Vaporflies, and I ended up having my slowest race of the year, running about 26 seconds slower than I had run 4 weeks prior, and 27 seconds off my PR from 6 weeks prior. But I don't think I can necessarily attribute this to the Vaporflies being worse than me, at least not fully. For example, if we compare my 5K results from this year, we can see that there are a bunch of differences across the races, potential confounding variables besides just the variation in the shoes that I wore in each race. So, for example, 2 of them were on the track at night, 2 were on the roads in the morning. The 4th of July race was quite warm. I think that had an effect. I tried taking the Morton bicarb for each of the track races. I don't know if that had an effect, positive or negative. And there's other potential differences that I'm not keeping close track of. You know, for example, the last race was quite windy on one of the stretches. Sleep could have been different in the lead up to each race. Or I could have just not been in the right headspace to run my best race on the day. And all of that is before we even get into my training. So I also looked at my mileage in the last 7 days before each race. I dropped it down intending to taper for this race, but that doesn't seem to have been helpful. I also looked at my mileage and workouts in the last 4 weeks before each race. In the earlier races, I was doing a little bit more work in the marathon / threshold pace range, which is like in the 5:30 to 6 minute per mile range. As for these more recent races, I did more work in the 5K and what I'm calling fast repetitions, so 5K pace and mile pace efforts essentially. And so maybe the threshold work is more effective. Or it could all boil down to the Vaporflies actually just being a couple percentage points less economical and they're therefore slower. Anyway, that's all a little bit of a tangent, but that's how I'm thinking about the shoes in the context of race performances. And that's why I'm excited to do this testing, where we can do our best to isolate the impacts to running economy of different shoes, and do our best to control for all the other confounding variables. I'm planning to do a repeat of this test with the changes that I mentioned, longer trials, and hopefully not losing the data in the middle of the trials. And beyond that, I've got a lot more tests that I'd like to do if I get confidence in my ability to do this testing. I have a lot more shoes I'd like to test. All the super shoes that I tested here have less than 10 miles on them, so they're relatively fresh. I'd like to test how they perform with more miles on them. The conventional wisdom is that super shoes are most effective in the first 50 or 100 miles. So I want to test how that performance changes over time. My Alphaflys have over 300 miles on them, and they still seem great to me in workouts, but I'd like to see how that translates to running economy. I'd also like to test at different paces. It could be that the Vaporflys are more economical at 6-minute pace, but they're less beneficial at faster paces, like closer to my 5K pace. And I'd like to test some of my friends to see which shoes are the best for them. I'd also like to figure out a way to test spikes. That would have to be a different format because I can't run on the treadmill in spikes, but that's something I'm interested in as well. And there are probably many more tests that I'll be interested in performing as I think of them or as they're suggested to me. So like and subscribe if you want to see more shoe testing or running related content, and I'll see you in the next video.